Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to part 2 of Finding Me in the ITV Networks. With me today, the Executive Directors of Media for Justice, Sipho, Singiswa and Gillian Schutte. In the first episode, we spoke much about the whole question about giving a voice to the voiceless, of the media being a platform for the voiceless, of the media and justice and raising the issues of justice. And towards the end, we spoke a little bit about racism, finding your identity, and about white privilege. And today I'd like to continue this particular discussion with comments both from Sipho and from Gillian. But if you don't mind, welcome again and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Gillian, I want to continue this a little bit further, where you were speaking about the white privilege and acknowledging, etc. But before you give me an answer, I would like to play a little video clip for the audience to see. That's when you spoke on the TEDx show, and you spoke about dealing with this whole question of racism. And when we come back, perhaps you can elaborate a little bit and speak about the concept of racism in the current South African climate. So I want you to watch this, and when we come back, Gillian will respond about that particular comment of hers on the TEDx show.
My child sat in the back seat of our car every day as I was on the way to the shopping centres, as I was going here and there, and he witnessed a world that was racially divided, that undervalued the well-being of the majority of people in this country. From what he could tell, white people had a much easier time of it, and so did golden people. It was what he witnessed and what our society reflected back to him that made him sometimes even push this much further and insist that he was not black. I was watching TV one night, the news, and it was even before the Zuma stage, and Kai came to me and said, "Mommy, black men are Tutsis, hey." I was shocked. I said to him, "Kai," and I often did this, I'd have to go back to the people in his life and take him through this process. "Kai, what color is Daddy?" "Daddy is black." "What color is Granddad?" "Granddad's also black." "Are they Tutsis?" "No." So, you see, Kai, don't let anyone tell you that all black men are Tutsis. It was then that I understood that I would have to step into a different reality to help my child navigate these multiple negative images that were coming out at us daily in the media about blackness. I would also have to find this vocabulary to explain the many racial incidents that were happening on our social landscape, but which our society chose not to discuss. Years later, Kai's bigger now, racism remains the one conversation that we simply do not want to have. And I am a firm believer that this is one of the reasons why our society remains an untransformed society 20 years into our democracy.
For those of you who watched the clip, I'm sure you must have been moved, because Gillian speaks wholeheartedly about difficult issues and how she had to, how she had to face them and how she had to deal with them. And Gillian, I think you would like to elaborate a little bit more about these issues of racism, the impact of whiteness on transformation, and how then you see racism and how do you deal with it?
Well, I don't think whiteness, was put under enough pressure to actually shift in South Africa with the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there's never been enough pressure on white people to actually change. So I find that because of that, we've kind of remained a stuck community. And obviously, there are people outside of that. So let's just make that clear. But for the most part, and that this thoughts transformation, because there's this, in this new kind of neoliberal dispensation, there's a move towards not acknowledging racism, sameness, multiculturalism, etc.
The Rainbow Nation.
The Rainbow Nation.
Yes.
And it's not real. That's just a cosmetic sort of veneer over something that's really festering underneath, and it keeps erupting on our social landscape. We've seen horrible incidents in the mainstream press. That Muslim man being beaten up, and the fact that people were silent around 10 protesters been killed at the beginning of this year, shot for rising up for their basic rights. For
the child that died in the toilet.
Child in the toilet?
Yes.
Well, that created some outrage. It's funny what people choose to get outraged. Yeah. That created outrage because people needed a reason to get outraged at Angie Macheka, yeah. Because there was already outrage around education. But how can you get outraged about that and ignore other issues of racist outbursts and human rights transgressions?
Sorry, but before you go further, I think, Sipho, you were making a very interesting comment when you said it in terms of acknowledging, as Gillian spoke earlier. She said in the first part where she said we need to acknowledge in order to move forward, and acknowledging is not enough. You need to transfer that into social activism. But you wanted to add something about acknowledging and related it to the judge.
Well, yes, I wanted to make an example that even in a court of law, in a criminal court, you'll often hear the magistrate or judge or the state prosecutor giving reasons why there should be heavy sentence or something along those lines, and justifying that demand by saying the accused hasn't demonstrated any remorse or acknowledge guilt, and therefore, there's no chance of rehabilitation. Even with the patients, the patient has to acknowledge that I am sick, I have this problem, and then undergo a process of healing. But if you don't,
denial, yes.
We don't know how to help you move forward, That was the point I was making in terms of, white guilt in South Africa.
Okay, but we have to go to a break. When we come back, Sipho, I would like you to just add a little bit more to me about this whole concept where you said South Africa is a festering wound, and explain that further. And then, Gillian, I want to take you up on a few more questions, but we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment, part 2 of Finding Me in the ITV networks today with Sipho and Gillian. And before we went into the break, Sipho, you were speaking about this, where even in a court of law, you have to acknowledge your guilt in order to start the healing process. If you're sick, you have to acknowledge that you have an illness in order to start the healing process. But you maintain that South Africa is a festering wound. Why?
Precisely because, you have huge disparities historically, I mean, the majority ANC government has inherited an apartheid infrastructure, and he hasn't really changed it radically. Mm-hmm. This impacts on how service delivery is accessed in different parts of our society, And that particular service delivery still goes along the lines of the apartheid infrastructure. I mean, if we talk about the government boasting that it's built so many RDP houses, you have to ask, in terms of racial integration in South Africa, where are these RDP houses? You drive on the highway, you see, black people, mm-hmm. because, so basically the government right now is expanding on an apartheid, on a very faulty apartheid infrastructure, whilst you have the sentence remaining the same and so on. And of course, this is the reason why, sections of our population do not understand the radical issues, the ills that, the poor in the so-called squatter communities that we name after the struggle heroes. How many times do you hear the Chris Hani squatter camp, the OR squatter camp, and so on? But look at the service delivery, no sanitation. What do we think about the women? What do the women in government today? Where is their empathy for the women and the children who live in those areas, especially areas that are named after their struggle heroes?
But while you were talking about infrastructure, I mean, I saw a video that you have made on Media for Justice, which you have posted, and it's about Mintails and the Tudor shafts. And in there you reiterate this continuation of the apartheid infrastructure and the implications of it. And the video is about Mintel. So it's about mine dumps in the black townships. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? And you speak about special areas that need to be readdressed. So tell us a little bit about Mintels, where it is, and what is the impact of it.
Mintels, this is one of the festering walking wound that I was referring to, my last response to you, and this now. Mintels is situated in the Kagiso, the Krugersdorp or West Rand area, and so on. It mines extremely close to the residential area there, and people have invested. It's not like your RDP houses. People have spent money, improving their properties and so on. With hard-earned money, as they say this themselves, and so on. And then you have this Australian listed company that comes, it hasn't had any public participation, engage the community, since they would be impacted and are actually impacted by their mining operations. Blasting, the houses are cracking, the crack noise, going through the community, and the mine dust, which if it gets into your lungs, it reduces your lung capacity, and the chances of recovering are very slim, if existing
but
at all.
I think you must point out that they're mining tailings,
yes,
which is old. They're trying to extract the last bit of gold out of that soil. That wasn't meant to be mined. And then they convinced, governments that they could, make a fortune out of that. So now it's impacting on the communities because it's 100 meters away from the Kagiso community.
100
where they're
meters.
doing 100 meters, where they're doing open cast blasting. So it's affected that immediate community right next to them. And as Sipho says, there was no...
And of course, when you're dealing with that negligence, you're also talking water seepages, uranium, heavy metals and so on in the water, which eventually will seep into drinking water and so on, And as long as people are in that community, it doesn't matter how much medication they take. When afterwards they go back to the source to live and eat, and do everything, bring up their children in an area that is so polluted, that's so poisoned and so on. Now people are saying post-1994, they never expected this to happen. People are talking about racism. They're talking about how this would never happen if it was white people living there, And of course the government, turns a blind eye, as we have seen when the minister came and said, you know what? We fought for this constitution and so on. Everyone has got rights. We fought for equal rights and so on. Likewise, the mining industry has got equal rights and so on. And after all, they've been mining here for more than 100 years. But that was very shocking from someone who has a struggle.
Did she say that?
She said that to the community.
I'm a bit shocked now.
She said it to the community. She said, well, just as much as you've got rights, the mining company has rights. And
Since when do corporates have greater rights than the citizens?
Fact,
because a government is governed, you're a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not for the corporates who don't vote.
And in fact, that's when people took to the streets. It was exactly right after she said that they walked out and they started to toy and burn, exactly because of that. I call it the Marie Antoinette syndrome.
Yes,
it's like
let them have cake. Okay, but very quickly, yes.
Over that 100 years that she boasted about, people have been forced to work in the mines in dire, unhealthy conditions and so on. People have lost limbs and so on. And yet she has the audacity to say, they've been mining here for more than 100 years. They've got equal rights as everyone.
Okay, but we can say the good news is that she's no longer the minister. Okay, we have to go to a break, Gillian. But before we go to, I want to pose my question to you so that you can think about it. Considering that this is reinforcing of the racism that has already been there, but we're focusing on white racism. But this, what you see, is a black government that is continuing and perpetuating the racism. So what about black on black racism? Is there going to be a discussion about that? Well, we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the final segment, part 2 of Finding Me in the ITV Networks, today with Gillian and Sipho. And we have so much to talk about, but so little time. But Gillian, considering what you both have just spoken about now, Miltels, the question that I asked you on black racism, and I'm going to come to that quickly, but before we do that, you raised a very important point in the break, and you said that in the areas that is not spoken about in the mainstream media, where the mines actually do uplift communities and contribute, one of those countries is Zimbabwe. Yet the mainstream media always portrays Zimbabwe and Mugabe as the land grabber, destroying, basically taking, not contributing, etc. But you're giving me a different side of the story. So if you can quickly comment on that, and then we can come to the question of black racism.
Well, a person that we often interview, who's David van Wyk from the Benchmarks Foundation, he does a lot of work in Zimbabwe, and these are the reports he has brought back, and I have read this in other developmental publications, etc., that in Zimbabwean mines there are hospitals, there's decent housing, there's school and education provided for the children. There, of course, is 51% ownership by government, and that's broken down, and I think about 10% of that goes directly to the community. So, they were threatened by the mine bosses that they would pull out, that they wouldn't invest in Zimbabwe on that basis, and in the end they did invest. So clearly the same can happen in this country.
And while you were talking about it, I'm thinking about one of Malema's tweets, when he tweeted just before the elections, and he said, South Africa owns 75% of the platinum, Zimbabwe owns another 5%. They can threaten to pull out, but they're not going to, because they need us more than we need them. So we need to start thinking about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you can now address this concept of black racism, and then Sipho, I'd like your comment after Gillian gives us a little bit about the whole understanding. And of course, racism structurally, personally, etc.
Well, I don't know if I would call it black racism as such. I'm of the belief, the Fananian belief that blacks can't be racist.
Right.
Because, as I say, it's a system of beliefs, it's a system of personal beliefs and practices and systemic and institutional racism, which is linked to power. And yes, governmental power, etc. as well. But the point is in South Africa, for instance, who really has the power? The power economic power still resides largely in the white elites and the white wealthy, and in the corporates, which is still largely white owned. So you're talking a minuscule amount of real economic power in terms of the black elite. However, there is something called selling out, selling your own people down the line, joining, becoming a part of the master narrative, being used by that master narrative. So I would have to find another term for that, because I can't see it as exactly as racism in the framework that's...
Yeah, but it's used by the master narrative, and I think I'd like to bring in a very good example, which would be Cyril Ramaphosa. I mean, because he was on the board of Lodman that brought about this massacre of the mining workers, of the miners, etc. And today he's the deputy president of our country. So for me, that's just shocking. That's a shocking master narrative, but it's exactly as you're saying. But Sipho, what are your comments? What are your thoughts on this particular issue?
Well, look, I'll start by, if you look at the concept of Rainbow Nation, it's quite amazing that, the Rainbow Nation for who? Who's celebrating a Rainbow Nation in South Africa when, the poorest of the poor don't have access to sanitation, drinking water and stuff like that. And also, if you look at the existing apartheid infrastructure, it has maintained the buffer zones where, for example, you have the racial hierarchy in South Africa where, and it was no fault of the people, the society today, but I doubt they are doing very much, because of the benefits, But to put it crudely, you had, the apartheid system giving various privileges to South Africans according to, the racial and cultural differences and so on, and ending up with black people right at the bottom. It's still the same. And the Rainbow Nation, when you analyze it properly, outside of the excitement, when we got excited with the honeymoon of the new South Africa, and when reality started setting in, people started talking about, the gravy train and this. Now reality was setting in, And today, again, people seem to be content remaining in that apartheid buffer zone area. So again, when you ask, black on black violence, there's a lot of that, unspoken black on black violence amongst ourselves, racism, Indian, colored, black people, and you see, and sometimes people, because they find themselves in that particular infrastructure, it is up to this government to actually say, listen, when we talk about racial integration in this country, we also talking about people living together. Otherwise, how are we going to know each other, When we talk about tourism, people often say, come to South Africa and experience cultural diversity like nowhere else in the world. Going back to the Cyril Ramaphosa issue, yes, Cyril Ramaphosa is a black man like anywhere, he takes the fall because he is very comfortable financially and so on, The Mintail top guys, majority of them British, How many times do you hear them defending the actions of a Mintail? But, when there's problems, you always see black guys like saying to the workers, man, we can't do it, please go to work. Or you see a black woman and so on. When there's successes in the mining industry, you will see a white person saying, we've made these gains and this,
Okay, but we're at the last. We've got a minute and a half and we need to wrap up. So what are your, what is the MFJ's main concerns and what would you like to leave us with? What are your final comments?
Well, our main concern is to provide a platform to hear a narrative, an actual narrative that belongs to people, their narrative, not a narrative that's broken down by, certain agendas, and to put the spotlight on transgressions against poorer communities by corporates and government, which helps their struggle, because we know media is power. If you get exposure on media, often people have to react and have to, reparations in terms of the actual transgression. And so that's what we need to see, more power for the people in media.
Sipho, what are your final comments?
Well, look, people are the power. People, exactly. Is what makes governments and so on. But now once you have a situation where the government doesn't listen to the people simply because they are poor and it only listens to the moneyed people, it's a cocktail for disaster. It leads to what I referred to earlier on, that, South Africa is like a wounded, it's like this big festering wound, that's oozing pus all over, and all we do, we just put a gauze on it, and it's going to explode on our faces, because particularly the black youth out in the poor areas, they're getting angry and angry. Sometimes they want to attack journalists, because they feel the journalists are not actually representing them truthfully, And often, I have to actually say, listen, you can't chase journalists away, because we are here to actually hear your truth and so on, so that, the whole of South Africa and the world can hear your concerns, your grievances.
Thank you. And we have to leave it at that, but let's hope the journalists actually are there to hear the truth and not to portray their own version of the truth. And Gillian, and I would like to end with a comment which you have written in one of your profound articles. I mean, for all of you who have the time and access to the internet, I would suggest you go onto the Media for Justice website and read the particular article that Gillian has written. It's a crude title. It's called The Politics of Shit. But it certainly is something worth reading and understanding about the struggle. And in there you mentioned that struggle is a process. And I think bringing forth the truth is also a process. So thank you very much for being here and for sharing your time with us. And of course for letting the audience or the viewers see deep into the struggles that you yourselves face.
Thank you,
Thanks
Quraysha.
for having us.
Thanks, Sipho. Thanks, Gillian. Fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.